The gravel crunched under my tires a full quarter-mile before I could see the house, and I already knew what today would sound like. I could hear it in my head, the way you hear a song you've played too many times. Every note landed exactly where you expect it, and there's no surprise left in it, only the small ache of familiarity. My name is Sarah Bennett. To the 6 people gathering in my parents' backyard right now, hanging string lights between the oak trees and setting out folding chairs, I am simply Sarah, the daughter who does something with the Army. A sentence people say and then immediately move past the way you'd note the weather before getting to the real conversation. To 12 men and women, 3,000 miles from here, I am Captain Bennett. Call sign Hawk 1. Air Mission Commander, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Neither version of me was lying today, both of us were just going to the same barbecue. I parked behind my brother's gleaming black SUV. New, I noted, replacing the one from 18 months ago that had apparently not been good enough anymore, and sat for a second with my hands on the wheel. My phone buzzed once in the cuff holder. I glanced down. Standby, possible recall window opening this weekend, details TBD. Opsell, I read it twice. Recalls happened. They happened during dinners, during birthdays, during the 2 hours of sleep you'd finally managed after 40 straight hours awake. You learned not to build your life around the assumption that any plan was permanent. I typed back a single word, copy, and put the phone in my jacket pocket, screen dark, and told myself it was probably nothing, a training contingency. It usually was. I was wrong about that, but I wouldn't know it for another 6 hours. I got out of the car, smoothed my shirt, and walked toward the sound of my father's laugh, already booming across the yard like he was addressing a stadium. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from driving toward a place you love and dread in equal measure, and I felt it settle into my shoulders the way it always did on this stretch of road. I'd made this drive more times than I could count. Home for Thanksgiving, home for graduations, home for the funerals of people who'd known me since I was small enough to ride on my father's shoulders at the county fair. Each time, some small, stubborn part of me packed a version of hope alongside my overnight bag. The same hope every time, worn thin from reuse. Maybe this time will be different. It rarely was. But I kept packing it anyway. I think that's just what it means to love people who don't quite know how to see you. The party was for my brother Tyler. He'd just been made regional director at the insurance firm he'd worked at since college, and my father had rented a small mountain of catering trays and told half the neighborhood. "There she is," my mother Diane said when she saw me, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like her rose hand lotion, the same brand she'd used my entire life. "You made it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, and meant it mostly. Across the yard, my father Walter had one arm slung around Tyler's shoulders and was telling a cluster of neighbors, the Hendersons I recognized and a couple I didn't, about the new corner office, the new title, the new everything. "Regional director at 31, Walter said, shaking his head like the achievement defied physics. "You believe that? Kids going places." Tyler caught my eye over our father's shoulder and gave me a small, almost apologetic smile. He'd always had that, a flicker of discomfort with how loudly our father celebrated him, like he knew the spotlight was too bright and too narrow, and he didn't quite know what to do with the parts of the room it left dark. I found a folding chair near the drink table and sat with a lemonade I didn't really want, just something to hold. A young man I didn't recognize came and sat 2 chairs down, glancing at me with the polite, assessing look of someone at a party full of strangers, looking for the one other person who also doesn't know everyone. "Daniel," he said, holding out a hand. "I went to state with Tyler. Been meaning to catch up with him for years. Finally got the invite." "Sarah," I said. "His sister." "Ah," he smiled. "The mysterious one. Tyler mentioned you're in the Army?" "Something like that," I said, and left it there, the way I always did. He didn't push, which I appreciated. We talked for a few minutes about nothing. Traffic on the drive up, whether the weather would hold, until my father's voice rolled toward us like weather of its own. "Daniel, glad you made it, son." Walter clapped him on the shoulder with the same overhand enthusiasm he used on everyone, then turned and saw me sitting there, and something in his face shifted into the particular expression he reserved for introducing me to people. Half pride, half punchline, and he never seemed to notice it wasn't the same thing. "And this," he announced, loud enough for the whole drink table to hear, "is my daughter. Flies helicopters for the Army." A pause, a little grin building at the corner of his mouth, the setup before the joke he'd told 100 times before. Basically a glorified bus driver. Fancier uniform, though. A ripple of polite laughter went through the small crowd. Daniel smiled too, out of reflex more than agreement, the way you laugh at your friend's father's joke, because that's the social contract. I felt the old familiar drop in my stomach, not pain exactly anymore, just a kind of flat recognition, like watching a rerun of a show you used to like. I had stopped being surprised by it years ago. What I hadn't stopped noticing was the way it landed differently depending on who was in the room to hear it. "Dad," Tyler said quietly, appearing at his shoulder. "Come on." "What? It's a joke." Walter turned back to the group, already moving on to the next story, already forgetting the sentence he'd just said, the way you forget a coin you've dropped in a fountain 1,000 times. I sat there a moment longer watching the condensation slide down my glass and thought, not for the first time, that if you played this exact scene back to me on a screen, I would be able to recite the next line before anyone said it. That was the strange part. Not that it hurt, that it was so familiar it barely had the shape of an event anymore, just a groove worn into a record, playing the same note every time the needle passed over it. He doesn't mean it unkindly, Diane said later, finding me by the fence while Tyler cut the cake inside. She always found me eventually, always with the same soft, worried apology in her eyes. "You know how your father is. Everything has to be something he can picture. A desk, a title, a number on a paycheck. It's not that he doesn't respect what you do, he just doesn't." She stopped, searching. "He doesn't have a shelf to put it on." "I know, Mom." "It would just be easier," she said, her hand light on my arm, "if you didn't take it so personally tonight. It's Tyler's night." Easier for whom? I didn't say. I never said it. My mother had spent 40 years making herself small in the space between my father's certainty and everyone else's feelings, and I understood, in the abstract, that this was its own kind of quiet exhaustion. She'd wanted to go to college for nursing once. I only knew this because my grandmother had mentioned it once at a funeral, like a secret she wasn't sure she was allowed to tell. My mother had given that up at 19 to help raise her younger siblings, and somewhere in the decades since, keeping the peace had become the only ambition she let herself keep. I couldn't hate her for it. I could only feel, sometimes, like I was living proof of a choice she'd made a long time ago and never quite forgiven herself for. "I'm not taking anything personally," I said, which was almost true. She squeezed my arm once and drifted back toward the house, already composing her face into the bright, unbothered expression she wore for the rest of the party, the one I'd watched her put on like a coat for as long as I could remember. I stayed by the fence a while longer, listening to the cicadas start up in the tree line, and thought about the year I'd left for basic training. I remembered standing in this same yard, 20 years old, duffel bag at my feet, and my father had shaken my hand, shaken it like I was a business associate, and said, "Well, hope you know what you're getting into." Not angry, not proud either, just uncertain, the way people get uncertain about things they can't file into a category they recognize. My mother had cried in the kitchen, where she thought I couldn't hear her, and when I found her there and asked if she was okay, she'd wiped her eyes fast and said, "I just wish you'd picked something a little safer is all." And I hadn't known at 20 that safety was the only language she had left to offer love in. I understood it better now. It didn't make the distance any shorter, it just made it easier to walk across without bleeding on the way. I want to explain something before I go further, because otherwise none of what happens next will make sense. There are two versions of me, and they do not overlap by accident. To my family, I am Sarah. Quiet, a little distant, hard to pin down. My job is something with the Army, a phrase that has functioned for over a decade as a wall nobody has ever bothered to knock on. Partly, that's on them. But partly, if I'm honest, that's by design. Some of it isn't mine to explain even if I wanted to. The regiment I fly for does not advertise itself. We don't wear unit patches on our uniforms in public. We don't post deployment dates. When people ask what I do, Army aviation is the true answer, and also the entire answer they're going to get, because operational security isn't a suggestion, it's a discipline drilled into you until it becomes reflex. The same way you learn not to leave your car unlocked in a bad neighborhood. You don't share what could get someone killed, and you don't share it because oversharing feels good in the moment. I learned that lesson formally in a classroom from an instructor who told us a story about a soldier's social media post that had, indirectly, cost lives on a different continent. I've never forgotten it. So when I say I never explained my work to my family, understand, some of that silence was never mine to break. I gave them the version of the truth I was allowed to give, and over the years that vague, permissible version calcified into their whole understanding of who I am. Sarah has a government job that's hard to explain. Nobody explains it because nobody, including me, is fully allowed to. The other version of me, the one my family has never met, exists behind a cockpit door. I joined the Army the summer after I turned 19, mostly because I didn't know what else to do with the specific restless energy that had never fit comfortably into any room I'd been given. I wasn't a rebellious kid. I did well in school, kept my head down, didn't cause my parents any particular grief. That there was always something in me that wanted a ceiling higher than the one I could see from our kitchen window. And when a recruiter set a stack of pamphlets on the table one afternoon and started talking about aviation programs, something in my chest recognized it, the way you recognize a word in a language you didn't know you spoke. My father hadn't understood it then either. He'd wanted me to go to state, like Tyler eventually would, get a business degree, find something practical. When I told him I'd enlisted, his first question wasn't, "Are you sure or are you safe?" It was, "Why would you do that when you could just get a real job?" I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, 19 years old, feeling something in me close quietly, like a door I wouldn't reopen for a long time. Flight school broke me down and built me back into someone I liked better. There's a specific, humbling honesty to learning to fly a helicopter. The aircraft does not care about your confidence, your excuses, or your feelings. It only cares whether your inputs are correct. I failed a check ride once, early on, badly enough that I sat in my car afterward and cried for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive back to the barracks. My instructor at the time, a blunt, kind warrant officer named Alvarez, found me still red-eyed at the flight line the next morning and said only, "Everybody fails something on the way to being good at it. The only real failure is deciding that means you should quit." I've carried that sentence with me through every hard year since. By the time I earned my wings, I understood something I hadn't understood standing in that kitchen doorway, that competence doesn't need an audience to be real. It only needs to hold up when it matters. I stopped needing my father to understand the shape of what I built, mostly. I remember one December years back sitting at the good table on Christmas Eve while Tyler told a long animated story about landing a new corporate account, his hand sketching shapes in the air. My father hanging on every syllable like it was scripture. The good china was out, the one my mother only used twice a year, and the whole dining room smelled like roasting turkey and the particular sharp sweetness of the candles she always bought and never let anyone else light. "So then I tell them," Tyler was saying, leaning forward, "that if they want the regional placement, they need to lock in before Q1 closes, and you should have seen the guy's face." "That's my boy," Walter said, refilling Tyler's wine without being asked, his whole chest seeming to expand a little with every sentence. "Knows how to close. I've been telling people that since he was 12, selling raffle tickets door to door. Natural. I'd just come off a month of high-altitude training in conditions that had broken 2 people out of our class. Real conditions, real cold. The kind that teaches your body what its actual limits are instead of the ones you assumed on a syllabus. There'd been a night up there where the wind chill had dropped low enough that we lost feeling in extremities inside 11 minutes if we weren't careful. And I'd spent 4 hours navigating a mock extraction route by instrument alone because visibility had gone to nothing. It had been, without exaggeration, one of the hardest physical and mental things I'd ever done. When there was finally a pause in Tyler's story, I mentioned it just to have something to say, just to feel for one dinner. Like the version of my life that actually took up most of my waking hours belonged at this table too. "That's nice, dear," my mother said, already turning back toward my brother, refilling his water glass the way she used to refill mine when I was small and couldn't reach the pitcher. "Tyler, tell them about the budget numbers again." That part was fascinating. My father chuckled into his wine glass. "Still playing with the government's expensive toys, huh? Must be nice. No accountability for the bottom line." I didn't say anything. I just watched the candlelight move across the tablecloth and thought about the mountain, the cold. The particular quiet of a ridgeline at 11,000 feet, where the only sound is your own breathing and the wind deciding whether to let you keep your footing. I thought about how strange it was that the hardest, most consequential things I had ever done in my life were also the things I was least able to say out loud at my own family's dinner table, partly because they wouldn't understand it. and partly because I wasn't allowed to give them the details that might make them understand it even if they tried. Later that night, doing dishes alongside my mother while the men watched a game in the other room, I tried one more time. It was a hard month, Mom. I mean it. People got hurt. Not me, but people did. She paused for just a second, hands still in the soapy water, something flickering across her face that might have been real worry. Then it passed, smoothed over, the way weather passes over a lake. "Well, I'm glad you're safe," she said, and handed me a plate to dry, and the conversation was over before it had properly started. 3 months after that Christmas, I was in the right seat of a UH-60M call sign Hawk 1. With a sandstorm eating the horizon in every direction, and a special forces team pinned on a ridge that had no business being landable, we'd launched 2 hours earlier out of a forward staging site so nondescript it didn't have a name. Most of us used out-loud night vision goggles, turning the whole world the color of old bruises, green and black and grainy at the edges. Reyes flew left seat, running the radios and the instruments with the unhurried economy of a man who had done this so many times his hands moved before his brain finished the thought. In the back, 2 crew chiefs manned the door guns, quiet, watching the terrain scroll beneath us the way sailors watch the horizon. The storm hit us 40 minutes out. Not a wall exactly, more a slow erasure, visibility collapsing meter by meter until the horizon disappeared and the world became instruments and faith. My training kicked in the way it's built, too, a decade of repetition compressing itself into pure muscle memory. Cross-check the gauges, trust the instruments over your inner ear, breathe. Hawk 1, that's a negative margin approach. Chief Warrant Officer 5 Marcus Reyes said over the intercom, his voice as level as if he were reading a grocery list. Reyes had more flight hours than I had hours of sleep in my entire adult life, and if he sounded calm, it was because calm was the only setting he had left after 2 decades of nights like this one. Wind's not going to give you a clean window. He wasn't wrong. A negative margin landing means there is no room for error. The rotor disc close enough to the rock face that a single bad gust could put the whole aircraft into the mountain and take everyone aboard with it. I'd trained for this exact scenario a dozen times in a simulator that could throw wind shear at you without consequence. The mountain in front of me now did not care what I'd practiced. "Copy," I said. "We're not leaving them up there." Below us, faint over the radio net, I could hear the team on the ground. Calm, professional, the particular clipped urgency of people trained not to sound afraid even when they have every right to be. Their team leader gave me a terrain read. I could barely see through the blowing sand, a narrow shelf of rock no wider than the aircraft's own footprint, exposed on 3 sides to a drop that didn't bear thinking about. "Talk to me, Chief," I said. "Winds gusting 18, gapping to 28, Reyes said. "You get a window, you're going to feel it before the instruments show it. Trust your hands." I brought the aircraft down through the last 100 feet and inches, feeling the wind try to shove us sideways, correcting again. My hands doing 100 small negotiations a second with a storm that did not care about any of us. Sand hissed against the windscreen loud enough to hear over the engines. Somewhere below, muzzle flashes flickered against the dark like a bad signal on an old television. The team was still taking fire, and every second we spent binding this landing was a second they spent exposed on open rock. 50 feet, Reyes called. 40. "Watch your left, you're drifting." I corrected. The tail rotor came close enough to the rock face that I heard, or maybe only felt, the air pressure change against the fuselage. A small, terrible intimacy between machine and mountain that lasted less than a second and felt like an hour. The gear kissed rock, held. The airframe groaned under the strain of it, and for 2 of the longest minutes of my life, I held that helicopter as still as a held breath while 4 operators scrambled aboard through a wind that was trying to tear the doors off their hinges. One of them stumbled, went down hard on one knee against the ramp, and a crew chief hauled him up by the vest strap without breaking stride. The last man in, a team sergeant I'd later learn was named James Cole, paused at the door before climbing the rest of the way in, looked toward the cockpit through the storm and the noise, and gave a single sharp nod. It wasn't a thank you. It was something more specific than that, a kind of professional accounting one operator to another. A currency that only means something between people who've had their lives in each other's hands and come out the other side of it. My father had never once looked at me like that. I don't think it had ever occurred to him that there was a version of respect that didn't come wrapped in a job title he recognized. We lifted off the ridge with the rotor blades close enough to rock on both sides that I didn't breathe again until we cleared the ledge by 30 feet, and then the mountain fell away beneath us into the storm. And there was nothing left to do but fly the aircraft home and let the adrenaline finish its long, slow drain out of my hands. We got everyone home that night. Nobody outside a small, specific circle of people will ever know it happened, and that's the point. That's the job. There would be no headline, no medal ceremony with cameras, no story my father could tell his neighbors over a beer. Just a debrief, a maintenance check on an airframe that had earned its rest, and 4 operators who would fly home to their own families in a few weeks and never mention a ridge in a sandstorm at all. Reyes clapped my shoulder once as we walked off the flight line afterward, helmet under his arm, sand still gritting in his teeth. "Nice hands tonight, Captain." "Bird your calm," I said. He almost smiled. "Almost. Keep borrowing it. It's the only thing keeping either of us alive out here." Back at the party, the sun was starting to lean golden low through the trees, and somebody had put music on, and my father, 3 beers deep into a good mood, had drifted into that expansive, magnanimous state where he told stories he'd already told a dozen times as if they were fresh. "You know what gets me," he said to a small cluster that included Daniel and 2 of the neighbors, his voice pitched to carry, "is these government jobs. Taxpayer money just." He made a vague gesture, floating around up there. "Meanwhile, my son's out there actually building something, actually earning it." "Dad," Tyler said again, lower this time, an edge of real discomfort in it now. "I'm not talking about you," Walter said, waving a hand at Sarah without quite looking at her. The universal gesture of a man who believes he is being generous by not saying a name out loud. "I'm just saying, flying around, burning fuel, coming home to tell everybody how important it all is, must be nice." I felt Daniel go very still beside me, not offended, thinking. I glanced at him and saw something working behind his eyes, a kind of quiet recalibration. "Something wrong?" I asked, low, just between us. He hesitated, the particular hesitation of a person deciding how much of his own job he's allowed to say out loud. "I work with the Bureau," he said finally. "Joint Task Force, mostly interagency liaison stuff. There was a name that came across a briefing a few weeks back, a rescue op, classified specifics, but the unit commander's name was Bennett. I didn't think anything of it. Bennett's not exactly rare." He looked at me for a second too long. "Guess I'm thinking about it now." I didn't answer that. I wasn't allowed to, and also some things you let sit rather than confirm out loud at a family barbecue with your father's laugh still hanging in the air like smoke. "Your dad's pretty hard on you," Daniel said instead, gently, like he wasn't sure if it was his place to say it. "He's not wrong that I fly a lot of fuel around," I said, and managed something close to a smile. "He's just missing some of the context." Daniel didn't push further, but I saw him glance toward my father once more, something recalibrating in his expression that hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier, the look of a person filing away a coincidence he wasn't sure was a coincidence at all. I excused myself a few minutes later to refill my drink, mostly just to have somewhere to put my hands, and found myself standing near the kitchen window, instead looking out at the yard, thinking about a conversation I'd had with Reyes a few weeks earlier back at the airfield, both of us leaning against the nose of the aircraft during a maintenance delay. "Board results should be in by fall," he'd said, not looking at me like he was talking about the weather. "You put together a solid package. Hale thinks you've got it. Don't jinx it, Chief." "I don't believe in jinxes. I believe in flight hours and good judgment, and you've got both." He'd glanced sideways at me then, something almost fond in it, in the gruff, understated way Reyes allowed himself to be fond of anyone. "Major Bennett. Has a ring to it." I hadn't let myself think about it too hard since then. You learn in this line of work not to spend emotional currency on things that haven't happened yet. But standing in my parents' kitchen that evening, watching my father hold court over people who would never know what that conversation with Reyes had meant, I let myself think about it for just a second. A small, private hope, held loosely, the way you hold something you're not yet sure you're allowed to want, out loud. My phone rang at 6:52 p.m. Not a text this time. A call, which in my line of work is its own kind of information before you even answer it. I stepped away from the tables, past the string lights, into the quieter dark near the tree line, and answered. "Bennett." "Captain." Colonel Patricia Hale's voice, unmistakable, brisk in the specific way that meant this was not a drill. Hale had commanded the regiment for 2 years, a woman who spoke in complete, economical sentences even at 3 in the morning, and I had never once heard her waste a word. I need you wheels up inside the hour. I can't give you details on an open line. Reyes is already moving. Pickup points the field 2 clicks east of your parents' address. It was already on our contingency list before tonight. Has been for 8 months. Has nothing to do with where you happen to be sitting. You're just the aircraft commander closest to it. Understood, ma'am. I kept my voice level, though my pulse had already climbed into the register it kept for moments like this. This isn't training, Captain. I need your head clear in 40 minutes. It will be. I know it will, she said, and there was something almost gentle underneath the briskness, the particular respect of a commander who has never once had to doubt the specific officer's ability to compartmentalize. Move. I felt my chest tighten, the old clean click of adrenaline, replacing whatever soft, tired feeling had been sitting there a second before. Copy, ma'am. 60 minutes. 40 would be better. 40, I said, and she was already gone. I stood there for a second with the phone still in my hand, the party noise behind me suddenly sounding very far away, like a radio in another room. Then I walked back toward the lights. I found Tyler first. I need to go, I said quietly. Work. I don't have details, and I mean that literally, not politely. He searched my face for a second. My brother has always been better at reading me than either of our parents, even if he's never known exactly what he was reading. Now? Like, right now? Right now? Right now? Is it? He stopped himself because he already knew I wouldn't answer and instead just nodded, quick and steady. Okay, go. I'll cover for you with Mom. I found my mother next and told her the same 3 sentences and watched her face do the thing it always did. Worry folding quietly under the surface of composure, the way she'd trained herself to keep it. Be safe, she said, and hugged me hard and fast, the way you hug someone when you don't have time for a long goodbye and both of you know it. My father was harder to find. He was holding court near the dessert table, mid-story, and when I touched his arm and told him I had to leave for work, he barely looked away from his audience. Now? Come on. Can it wait an hour? No, I said. It can't. He laughed, not unkindly exactly, just with the specific dismissiveness he reserved for anything about me that inconvenienced the story he was telling. Sure, work. All right, Sarah, drive safe. He turned back to his story before I'd even finished nodding, already reaching for the next punchline in the queue. Some new tangent about Tyler's negotiating skills that had the small crowd chuckling before I was 3 steps away. Shh. I didn't let it slow me down. There wasn't time to feel the sting properly and honestly some clinical. Professional part of my brain had already moved past it, filed it in the same drawer as every other minor inefficiency you learn to route around rather than fight. The way you'd note a stubbed door hinge and simply remember to push harder next time instead of demanding the house be rebuilt. I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with my father about the seriousness of my job was like arguing with the ocean about whether it was wet. I just nodded and walked back toward the tree line, toward the dark field beyond it. My pulse already shifting into the rhythm it kept for moments like this, steady, focused. Already halfway gone from the person I'd been 40 minutes ago. I heard it before I saw it. Everyone did. A low bass thrum first, felt in the chest before it registered as sound, growing, gaining texture, becoming unmistakably rotor blades. Conversation across the yard stumbled and died. People turned, confused, then searching the darkening sky, then, as the sound sharpened into something enormous and undeniable, alarmed. The aircraft came in low over the tree line without running lights, a black shape against a purple sky, and it did not glide the way people imagine helicopters gliding. It moved with the flat, disciplined intent of a machine built entirely for a purpose, and it dropped into a rock-steady hover over the open field just past the fence. Close enough that the rotor wash tore through the yard like a sudden storm front, napkins and paper plates spinning into the dark, someone's sun hat cartwheeling across the grass, the string lights swinging wildly on their wire. Somebody screamed, short and startled, and was immediately embarrassed about it. A folding table went over with a crash of dessert plates. The Hendersons' younger kid started crying, more from the noise than any real fear, and his mother scooped him up and pressed his face into her shoulder, both of them turning away from the wind. The whole backyard, which 20 minutes earlier had been full of the small, comfortable sounds of a suburban evening, had become something out of a different kind of world entirely, one that didn't usually intersect with birthday cake and rented folding chairs. I didn't look back at any of that yet. I was already moving, counting the aircraft down in my head the way I'd counted down 100 pickups before this one, some old steady part of my brain already 3 steps ahead of my body. I didn't run toward it like something out of a movie. I walked fast and level. The way you're trained to move toward an aircraft that's waiting on you and nobody else, steady enough that the crew chief watching from the open door wouldn't have to worry about me doing something careless in the dark. I glanced back once. My father was standing frozen near the dessert table, a paper plate forgotten in his hand, his mouth slightly open. The porch light throwing long shadows across a face that had gone the particular pale of someone watching a fact override an opinion in real time. My mother had both hands pressed to her chest. Tyler was staring, and for just a second something crossed his face that looked almost like relief, like a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had suddenly shifted onto someone else's shoulders. Daniel wasn't looking at the helicopter. He was looking at me. I didn't shout anything dramatic, there wasn't time, and it wasn't the moment for it. I just met my father's eyes across a ruined lawn for 1 second, not smug, not triumphant, just steady, and said, loud enough to carry, calm enough not to need to be, "I told you." Then I turned and went to work. The crew chief hauled me aboard, harness clipped in 3 practice motions, and the aircraft was already climbing before the door was fully shut, nose dipping. G-force pressing me back into the seat as the ground and the string lights and the ruined dessert table fell away below us into the dark. I didn't think about my father again for the rest of that night. There wasn't room. There was only the mission. The way there always is. The way I'd trained for a decade to make sure there always would be. I wasn't there for what happened on the ground after we lifted off, but I heard about it later. Most of it from Tyler in a phone call a few days after. His voice quieter than I was used to. He said the yard had gone dead silent once the sound of the rotors faded into the distance, the party guests standing around in the wreckage of paper plates and toppled chairs, like people waking up from something. He said our father hadn't said a word for almost 10 full minutes, just stood there looking at the dark sky where the aircraft had gone, holding a paper plate he'd apparently forgotten he was holding. Daniel had walked over to him eventually. Tyler said their father had tried to laugh it off, something about quite the show, and Daniel had just looked at him, not unkindly, and said, "That's a special operations aircraft, Mr. Bennett. Whatever your daughter does, it's not a bus route." He hadn't elaborated. He wasn't allowed to either. He just handed my father a business card, said it had been nice meeting everyone, and left. My father, according to Tyler, had stood in the driveway a long time after everyone else went home, looking at that card under the porch light like it belonged to a language he didn't speak yet. My mother called me 2 days later, her voice smaller than I was used to hearing it. "I keep thinking about all the times I told you to let it go," she said, without preamble, the way she never usually started a conversation. "All those years, I thought I was keeping the peace. I don't think I understood what it was costing you to keep quiet along with me." "You didn't know, Mom. I never let you know. That's on both of us." "I should have asked harder questions," she said. "I was always so scared of upsetting your father that I never stopped to think about what my not asking was doing to you." A pause, and I could hear her take a breath on the other end, steadying herself. "I looked up the 160th online. There isn't much. I suppose that's the point." "That's the point," I agreed gently. "I don't need to know everything," she said. "I think I just needed to know that not knowing wasn't the same as not caring. I don't think I ever told you that." I stood in my kitchen a long moment after we hung up phone, still warm in my hand, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for so long I'd stopped registering it as tension at all, just as the ordinary shape of things. A few weeks later, Daniel's work brought him briefly back into contact with the edges of my world. A routine interagency verification tied to the same rescue operation he'd half remembered at the party. Nothing dramatic. Mostly paperwork and phone calls confirming names and unit affiliations across agencies that don't always talk to each other well. Names had to line up across 3 different systems before a joint after-action file could be closed out, and somewhere in that process, a supervisor had asked Daniel almost offhand whether he had any personal read on Captain Bennett's reliability. Since his name had come up as a secondary point of contact to Tyler, it was a small, procedural question. It also, Daniel told Tyler later, made him uncomfortably aware of how close carelessness at a family barbecue had come to becoming carelessness on the record, how a stray comment from a father who thought he was just being funny could, in a different set of circumstances, have planted a seed of doubt in exactly the kind of file where doubt isn't supposed to live. He hadn't repeated any of what Walter said, of course, but it stayed with him enough that he mentioned it to Tyler, gently, not as gossip, but as something closer to a warning. Words don't stay where you say them. Be careful whose credibility you're spending when you make a joke. Tyler told me later that our father hadn't said much when he heard that. He'd just gone quiet, the particular quiet of a man realizing for the first time in his adult life that his words had weight he'd never bothered to calculate. Nobody filed anything. Nobody was punished. It wasn't that kind of story, but something in my father shifted that week, Tyler said. Not an apology, not yet, just the first crack in 30 years of certainty. He asked me if I thought you'd ever forgive him, Tyler said when he called to tell me about it. I told him I didn't think that was really the question he should be asking. What'd he say to that? Asked what the right question was. Tyler paused. I told him maybe it was whether he was ready to actually listen instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He didn't love that answer, but he didn't argue with it either, which for Dad is basically a personal breakthrough. Tyler called me himself, separately, about a week after that. Can I say something? He asked, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully, which wasn't like him. I think I let it happen. Dad's thing. The jokes. I never told him to stop because some part of me liked being the one he was proud of. I never thought about what that cost you to sit there and take it every single time. I didn't say anything for a second because I wasn't expecting it and because there's a particular kind of quiet that follows someone finally naming something you've both been avoiding for years. You were a kid too, Tyler, I said finally. You didn't build the stage, you just got put on it. Doesn't mean I couldn't have said something. I remember one Thanksgiving, I don't even know if you remember this, you'd just gotten back from some training rotation and you were exhausted like gray in the face. Exhausted. And Dad made some comment about you needing a real vacation instead of playing soldier, and I laughed. I actually laughed, Sarah, because it was easier than the alternative, and I've thought about that a lot since that night in the yard. About how many times I picked easy. I don't remember that particular Thanksgiving, I admitted. There were a lot of them that blurred together. That's almost worse, he said quietly. That it wasn't even a big enough moment for you to remember specifically. Just background noise. That's what I let it become for you. Background noise. You were 22 and trying to survive Dad's version of approval. Same as I was, just from the inside of it instead of the outside, I said. I'm not interested in relitigating who failed harder at being a kid in that house, Tyler. I'd rather know what you're doing now. Now, I tell him to knock it off, Tyler said. Every time, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable, honestly, because I think that's the whole point I missed for 30 years. Comfortable was never actually free. Somebody was always paying for it. I just didn't notice it was you. He didn't apologize outright, not in the neat movie kind of way. He just said, I'm proud of you. I don't think I've ever actually said that out loud, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and I let him have the silence that came after it instead of filling it with something easier. For what it's worth, I said eventually, I never needed you to fight him for me. I just needed you to see it. You see it now. Yeah, he said, I see it now. Yeah, he said, I see it now. 6 months later, I stood at the front of a briefing room that smelled like coffee and dry erase markers, a slide of mission graphics glowing on the screen behind me, 12 operators and aircrew watching with the specific, focused stillness of people who take briefings seriously because their lives depend on the details. Colonel Hale sat in the second row, arms folded, missing nothing. James Cole, the team sergeant I pulled off that ridgeline all those months ago, sat near the front, arms crossed, watching me with the same steady attention he'd once given a mountainside in a sandstorm. He'd sought me out in the hallway before the brief, unexpectedly, and shaken my hand. Didn't get the chance to properly say it that night, he'd said. You held that bird like it was bolted to the rock. My whole team's alive because of about 4 inches of margin you found that shouldn't have existed. Wanted you to hear that from me, not just a nod in a storm. You'd have done the same for me, I'd said, and meant it. That's not really the point, he'd said, but thank you for saying it anyway. Now standing at the front of the room walking 12 people through terrain graphics and timing windows for an operation none of us would ever discuss outside these walls. I felt the particular clean calm that only ever showed up for me in rooms like this one. No performance required. No explaining myself to anyone who didn't already understand exactly what was being asked and what it would cost. When I finished walking the room through the air insertion plan, Cole spoke first, his voice pitched to carry to the whole room. My team's confidence in the air package is total, Major. Major. Not Sarah. Not captain even. The promotion board had come through 3 weeks earlier, and Reyes had been the one to pin it on me in the hangar. No ceremony beyond a handshake and 4 teammates clapping. In that room, I had exactly one name that mattered, and it wasn't the one on my parents' Christmas cards. There were no toasts for it. No rented tables, no catering trays, no neighbors gathered to hear about it secondhand. There was only the quiet, specific respect of people who understood exactly what the work cost because they'd paid some of that cost themselves. It was a currency my family had never learned to spend, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't need them to. I found something closer to family that night in a hangar that smelled like jet fuel and cold concrete, sitting on an equipment crate with Reyes and 2 young crew chiefs, passing a bottle of water between us because none of us had the energy left to talk much. We'd flown a hard mission and brought everyone home, and there's a particular silence that settles over people after that. Not empty, but full. The kind you don't need to explain to each other because you were all inside it together. One of the crew chiefs, a 24-year-old named Ortega, who still had the slightly wide-eyed intensity of someone who hadn't yet let the job become routine, broke the silence first. "Can I ask you something, Major? Off the record, or whatever the version of off the record is around here. Go ahead. Does it ever stop being scary? The margin stuff. Tonight when you brought us down through that gap." He shook his head. "I've flown with you 11 months, and I still felt my stomach drop." I considered the question honestly, the way it deserved. "It doesn't stop being scary," I said. "It stops being about you. That's the difference. The fear's still there every time. You just stop making room for it to be the loudest thing in the cockpit. There's not enough space in there for both the fear and a job, so you choose the job, and eventually your hands believe you even when the rest of you is still catching up." Ortega nodded slowly, filing it away the way young aircrew file away things said by people they respect, and Reyes bumped my shoulder with his, a small, wordless approval. "Good brief, Major." "Thanks, Chief. Your dad know yet?" I thought about it. "Not yet." "He will," Reyes said, not unkindly, and went back to looking at nothing in particular, the way tired people do when they finally stop needing to perform, being awake. We sat there another 20 minutes, mostly quiet, passing the water bottle around until it was empty, watching the hangar lights hum against the dark outside. Nobody needed to fill the silence with conversation. That was, I come to understand, its own kind of intimacy, the kind you only earn with people who've trusted you with their lives and had that trust repaid. My phone buzzed on the desk a few nights after that, while I was tracing a training route across a paper map, half listening to the hum of the buildings settling around me. A text from my father. My chest did something complicated and old before I even opened it, some reflex from childhood. I thought I'd outgrown some part of me that still, after everything, went briefly still at the sight of his name on a screen. "Your mother and I saw something on the news about a rescue overseas. They didn't say much. Was that you?" I read it twice. It was the first time in my life he had asked me a direct question about my work that wasn't a setup for a joke. The first time the question mark at the end of a sentence about me had been an actual question, instead of a punchline waiting to land. Something small and old in me, the part that had spent 30 years quietly hoping for exactly this, felt a brief, real flicker of something like relief. But it passed quickly, the way a held breath finally lets go. I didn't need the question answered from my end anymore. That was the strange, hard-won part of it. The anger had mostly burned itself out somewhere over the last 6 months in briefing rooms and hangars, and the particular clarity of a cockpit at 3 in the morning. What was left wasn't peace exactly. Peace makes it sound finished, and nothing between my father and me was finished, but it was something close to it, a kind of quiet that didn't depend on him anymore to hold its shape. I typed back 4 words. "Can't say. Love you." Then I set the phone face down on the desk and went back to the map in front of me, tracing the line of a flight path I hadn't flown yet, toward a future that no longer needed my father's permission to matter. I saw my father again about a month after that briefing, at a cousin's engagement dinner, low-key enough that neither of us had much of an audience to perform for. He found me by the drink table, the same kind of table I always seemed to end up near at these things, and stood next to me a while without saying anything, which was for him its own kind of unusual. "Your mother told me some of it," he said finally. "What she could piece together anyway. The 1/60th. He gestured vaguely. The same vague gesture he used to use when talking about my job dismissively. except this time it looked less like dismissal and more like a man genuinely out of words. I looked some of it up. What I could find, which wasn't much. There isn't much to find, I said. That's on purpose, I figured. He turned his glass slowly in his hand. I've been thinking about that night in the yard a lot, not just the helicopter, before that. All the times before that. I don't have a good excuse, Sarah. I understood Tyler's job because I could picture it. Numbers, offices, deals. I never bothered picturing yours because it scared me a little, if I'm honest. Easier to joke about something than admit I didn't understand it and didn't know how to ask. I hadn't expected that. Not the specifics of it, not the particular unguarded honesty of it. My father had never once, in 30-some years, admitted to being scared of anything. I'm not asking you to explain the job to me, he continued, quieter now. I know you can't. I'd like to know you. The parts I'm allowed to know anyway, if you'll let me start now, late as it is. It's not too late, Dad. He nodded, and neither of us said anything else about it that night, which felt right. Some repairs don't happen in a single conversation. They happen slowly, in small deposits, the way trust always rebuilds, not all at once, and not without a few false starts along the way. But it was a start, and for 30 years, I hadn't had one of those from him at all. People ask me sometimes in the careful roundabout way. People ask about things they don't quite know how to name, whether it's hard, being the daughter nobody quite understood for so long, being the one whose accomplishments got measured in politeness instead of pride. The truth is more ordinary than the question wants it to be. It was hard, the way most long, quiet things are hard. Not one dramatic wound, but a slow accumulation of small ones, the kind that don't leave a mark you can point to. Just a weight you carry so long you stop noticing you're carrying it. I think that's true for a lot of people, not just the ones in uniform. The nurse whose family thinks she just hands out pills. The teacher whose brother-in-law jokes about his summers off. The parent doing the invisible, exhausting work of holding a household together while somebody else gets the toast at Thanksgiving. Being underestimated isn't a military problem. It's a human one, the particular loneliness of doing something real in a world that only knows how to applaud the things it already understands. What I'd say to anyone sitting where I used to sit, quietly enduring a version of this at their own family's table, is this: you don't owe anyone a dramatic reveal to make your work matter. It already matters whether or not the room ever finds out. The helicopter in my parents' backyard didn't make my job real. It was already real, every single day I'd been doing it. All the aircraft did was make it visible to people who'd never bothered to look. What changed wasn't my father becoming a different man overnight. He didn't. He's still Walter, still louder than he needs to be, still more comfortable with numbers he can see than jobs he can't picture. But something in him cracked open a little that night in the yard. Enough light getting in that he started, slowly, asking real questions instead of telling old jokes. That's not everything. But it's not nothing either. What changed more, honestly, was me. I stopped needing the crack to become a door. I stopped waiting by it. My father used to say my head was in the clouds, like it was an insult, like ambition above a certain altitude was somehow less serious than ambition measured in corner offices and quarterly numbers. He wasn't entirely wrong. My head has been in the clouds for a long time now, over mountain ridges and sandstorms, over rooftops in the dark, over places I'm not allowed to name, doing work most people will never know happened. He thought I was driving a bus. In a way, I guess he wasn't wrong about that either. I just drive the kind of bus that goes into the worst nights other people will ever live through and brings them back out the other side. If you've ever had to prove what you're worth to people who'd already decided they knew, tell me about it in the comments. I promise you, in this particular corner of the internet, we know exactly what that ride looks like.